there's great dispute over this, but many different scientists try to study how important is IQ to job performance through life. And again, there's great variation in the results. But I would say the mean is somewhere around that IQ explains about 25% of the variation in job performance, which is very significant. IQ does matter. But even so, 75% is explained by other things. And what other things are those? I'm just going to run through a list of the kind of traits and talents which I don't think we normally pay attention to, but which I think are actually tremendously important in who's going to do well in life. And so the first trait is mindsight, the ability to be with somebody, go into their mind, and sort of absorb and understand what's happening in their mind. Babies are born with this skill. Alan Meltzoff, who's at the University of Washington, leaned over a baby who was 43 minutes old. He wagged his tongue at the baby, and she, 43 minutes old, wagged her tongue back at him. She didn't know what a person was, what a face was, what a tongue was, but she knew to imitate. And that's how people mimic, and that's how people build relationships. About 55% of the kids in North America and Europe are what they call securely attached. By age 18, they've developed a two-way relationship with mom. And those kids not only have the ability to relate to mom, they have a model in their head to how to build relationships. So when they go to school, they'll do much better. And scientists at the University of Michigan, or Minnesota, looked at kids' attachment patterns, how they relate to mom, at 18 months, and they found they could predict with 77% accuracy who was going to graduate from high school just by this one test at 18 months. And that power to relate is tremendously powerful. About 20% of the kids are what they call avoidantly attached. They've sent signals to mom, but for whatever reason, no signal has come back. Those kids do much less well in school because they don't know how to relate to teacher. One of the teachers wrote a paragraph about an avoidantly attached kid coming into the classroom, and he's like a sailboat tacking into the wind. He wants to get close to teacher, but doesn't know how to do it. And avoidantly attached individuals at age 70 are going to have 1/3 fewer friends. Now, no life course is set by 18 months, but models and pathways open up, which can be either confirmed or disconfirmed by later experience. And that's a sort of unconscious model building that is tremendously important. And some people have the ability. I was with, about 6 months ago, I was with Michael Milken. And he's one of those people, when you're with him, he's just boring into you, and he wants to know what you know, and he's going to take it away. And we've all met people like this. So that's one trait. The second trait is one you might call equipoise. And that's the ability to have the serenity and maturity to monitor your own biases and shortcomings. We are all overconfidence machines. We all think we understand what we're thinking, even though we don't. 96% of college professors believe they have above average teaching skills. In the US, Time Magazine asked Americans, are you in the top 1% of earners? And 19% of Americans are in the top 1% of earners. And 35% expect to be next year, by the way. Two researchers, Paul Schumacher and Edward Russo, gave tests to executives and then asked them to evaluate how well they did on their test. And so they gave tests to advertising executives about the advertising industry, and the executives thought they got about 80% of the answers right. In fact, they got 60% of the answers wrong. The most overconfident industry is the computer industry. Executives there thought they got the answers 95% right. In fact, they got them 80% wrong. This, by the way, is an extremely gender-linked trait. Men drown at twice the rate as women because men have tremendous confidence in their ability to swim after they've been drinking. And so if you ask, most traits are not that gender-linked, IQ and all that stuff. There's no real gender relationship. But the ability to notice details, women do better, and self-confidence, or at least the ability to broadcast self-confidence. So if you ask men about their GPA or their IQs, they'll give you a number 20% higher than reality. Women on average, and again we're talking across populations, will give you an accurate or even slightly below. But anyway, overconfidence is, to me, the primary business trait. But some people have the ability to be open-minded in the face of ambiguity, to weigh the strength of their conclusion to the strength of their evidence, to be modest in the face of partial knowledge. And there's a scholar right here at Toronto who tried to correlate these abilities, these what they call metacognitive skills, the ability to look at yourself and sort of evaluate your own thinking process. And they're somewhat related to IQ, but not strongly related. But they are very important skills. And some people have modesty bootstraps they construct for themselves. So I think it was Peter Drucker who had a famous one where every time you make a decision, write down your reasoning and seal it in an envelope for 9 months, open it up. You'll find that a third of your decisions turned out to be right, a third were wrong, a third were in the middle, but in almost all cases, your reasoning was completely irrelevant to the task at hand. Another one I read about recently was to write a pre-mortem. You're about to make a big decision. Imagine that you're a year hence, and that decision has turned out disastrously wrong. Write a history of why that decision turned out so bad. Because we all have a tendency to not imagine the negative side. And so these are sort of modesty bootstraps. The third trait is, I borrow a Greek word, metis, to describe this. This is the ability to look across a landscape and see patterns. So my newspaper did a story of soldiers in Iraq who could look across down a street and they could tell whether there was an IED, a landmine in the street. And if you ask them, how do you know? They couldn't tell you. They just feel a coldness inside. And this comes from constant observation. This is not innate. They observe streets a lot. And unconsciously, they develop the ability to recognize patterns and the ability to recognize when those patterns are askew. And this comes from a long history of constant exposure to things. A study that illustrates this was done on chess grandmasters. They asked them to give them 5 seconds to memorize a chessboard. And chess grandmasters could memorize a board easily, every piece on it, in 5 seconds. Then they gave chess novices 5 seconds to memorize a chessboard. They could memorize like 4 or 5 pieces. And that's because the chess grandmasters, they were not smarter. They saw the board differently. They didn't see individual pieces. They saw formations of pieces. The difference between memorizing a story and memorizing the individual letters of a paragraph. So they moved the chessboard around so the pieces were in a formation which could never actually occur in a chess match. And in those circumstances, the grandmasters were no better than anybody else. But if you closely observe something, you begin to see it differently, and you develop this skill, metis. The fourth is sympathy, the ability to be sensitive to the people around you. Groups, most of us work in groups, and that's because groups are much smarter than individuals. When they give groups tests, there's something called the Wausau selection task, and individuals, groups solve them much faster. And the IQ of a group is not determined by the IQ of the members in it. It's determined by how often they take turns while conversing. It's the emotional sensitivity. It's also influenced by motivation. People are much more motivated when they're in groups. Again, a study I saw after I finished the book, somebody looked at the swim times in the last Olympics. And they compared the swim times of the swimmers when they were in the individual events versus those same swimmers when they were part of a relay team. And people swim much faster when they're part of a relay team. And if they're in the third or fourth leg, they swim especially fast because they feel essential to the team. And so groups just work a lot better, and the ability to work well in groups by being sympathetic to the other members of the group, tremendously important skill. And one final thing to be said about that was face-to-face groups outperform electronic groups. So at the University of Michigan, they did a study where they gave groups tests. Some groups met face-to-face and had 10 minutes to solve the tests. They could solve the math problems, no problem. Other groups had 30 minutes, but they had to communicate by email. And those groups could not solve the problems. They broke up. And so beware teleconferences, because so much of our communication is by smell, intonation of voice, gesture. And that kind of skill, again, unevenly distributed.